What's up, YouTube? Welcome back. So, I want to share a book review that was published in the Bureau of Labor Statistics publication called the Monthly Labor Review, and it was published back in May of 2012. And the title of the book, as well as the review, is Race and Economics. And it's a book by an economist named Walter E. Williams. And it's sort of pretty much the book, like Walter's book, is an argument that basically government intervention tends to hurt black people more than help black people when it comes to economics. Right? Like, let's see. It says, like, many people in government and academia argue that government imposed allocation of resources rather than free market resource allocation is needed to keep minorities from being subject to discrimination by the majority and big business. So translation, pretty much, we're talking about government intervention of economic policies versus just letting the economy do what it do, right? And Walter, for the record, is black/African American, and he's kind of taking more of a conservative approach with this. And he presents the receipts to back up his arguments. And in this review, I'm going to go through some of those receipts and some of his arguments. All right. So a little information about Walter. He's the author of 10 books, including Up from the Projects, an autobiography in which he describes his journey as a black man from Philadelphia, a housing project in Philadelphia, to the faculty of George Mason University in Fairfax, Virginia, where he has served as the John M. Olin Distinguished Professor of Economics since 1980. All right. So, that was a little information about Walter. Now let's get into his arguments. All right. So throughout his book, Race and Economics, Dr. Williams, Walter, promotes the idea that economics and profits usually trump personal feelings and prejudice. He uses the sport of baseball as an example of this idea. Right? Jackie Robinson breaking the color barrier in 1947 as, an important event. And the argument is that team owners realized that a whites-only policy would lead to losses to teams with more talented black players, which would lead, in turn, to lost fans and lost revenue. Owners couldn't justify paying more to less talented white players than their abilities would dictate. In other words, the owners could not afford to discriminate. So basically, in that argument, Walter is saying that ultimately people will go with the money, right? Whatever will earn them the most money. In that case, what earned them the most money were the black players. So those white team owners acquired black players in order to successfully compete. All right. Next, Walter speaks out strongly against policy intended to help those in poverty who are members of minority groups. In doing so, he finds support from Frederick Douglass, a hero of the African American community. So this is a quote, quote unquote, everyone has asked the question. And this is from Frederick Douglass, by the way. This is a quote from Frederick Douglass. So, quote unquote, everyone has asked the question, what shall we do with the Negro? I have but one answer from the beginning. Do nothing with us. And if the Negro cannot stand on his own legs, let him fall also. All I ask is give him a chance to stand on his own legs. Um, so, next part of this article is, the current unemployment rate as of April 2012 was at 8.1%, and it would be higher if it included those who wanted full-time work but also accepted part-time work and those who gave up searching for employment. The employment rate among African Americans is much higher still, currently more than 15%. Historically speaking, African Americans have usually had the highest rates of unemployment, right? You know, and let's see, and more than 40% among black youths aged 16 to 24. So it's more than 40%. The unemployment rate for black youths aged 16 to 24 is about 40%. So it's like really high for them. Let's see. Is the higher rate among black Americans and African Americans the result of discrimination? That's a good question. Because, like I said, black people have historically had the highest rates of unemployment. So perhaps does that come from a legacy of discrimination against black people? And as well, the Native American population also has a high unemployment rate too. Actually, I think theirs may actually be higher than black people's, but since Native American people are usually not even really considered a factor and a people of the past, usually people don't even acknowledge them, sadly. Again, the legacy of colonization, right? Genocide, the indigenous population, and dehumanized African slaves. All right. Williams would answer that this is not discrimination. He comes to this conclusion by comparing current employment rates with unemployment rates of 100 years ago, a time of much greater discrimination. In 1900, for example, the employment to population ratio was 57.4% for non-whites and only 45.5% for whites. By 1990, these ratios had reversed, with the rate for non-whites falling slightly to 56.2%, while the ratio for whites rose to 63.6%. All right. So, next, on March 31st, 1931, Congress passed the Davis-Bacon Act. First time I've heard of that. This bill, which Walter believes was pushed by labor unions seeking higher wages and would exclude black workers who were willing to work for less, right, mandated the payment of locally prevailing wages and benefits on all federally financed or federally assisted construction projects that exceeded $5,000, reduced to $2,000 in 1935. Once the bill became law, black unemployment began rising relative to that of whites. Per Williams, this effect was further compounded by the passage of several other pieces of New Deal legislation, such as the Fair Labor Standards Act, FLSA, the Walsh-Healey Act, the National Labor Relations Act, and even the Social Security Act. So Walter argues that this law helped those workers at the low end of the wage scale, but only those who could keep their job, because employers were not likely to keep an employee whose productivity was worth $6 an hour if the employee had to be paid $7 an hour. Williams concedes that some of those who advocate for a minimum wage law do so with good intentions, believing that an increase in the number of people paid a living wage, quote unquote, will reduce the poverty rate, right? And we have heard about, talking about folks wanting to increase the minimum wage laws to like $15 an hour. And I don't think that that's going to go over well, honestly, um, just because I don't think small businesses can really afford to pay people $15 an hour, you know. But it depends, you know. However, his view of however, it is his view that these actions have also been with the goal of protecting the jobs of white workers. He cites union workers in apartheid South Africa who demanded um, equal pay for equal work laws so that blacks could not be hired for less and thereby usurp their jobs. So it's kind of like, oh, they want to pay these folks less, and then they're thinking that white people are like, well, no, we want these equal laws in place so that you can't get black people to do this job for less money. So feeling like, okay, that's kind of like where these labor unions sort of partially originated from. And black people were excluded from labor unions, by the way. That's part of the equation too. So again, these labor laws, weren't more so. That would help Walter's argument more, since it's like, oh, these white people are arguing for labor union laws and all that good stuff, and also excluding black people from them, right? Um, See, Walter also decries occupational licensing laws. So kind of like occupational licensing laws, basically laws that require you to have a license to practice certain occupations. Like for some occupations, such as medicine and law, licensing laws are clearly needed, of course. So he acknowledges that. But there are now approximately 800 occupations that require licenses in at least one state. Such as barbers, cosmetologists, taxi drivers, beekeepers, even fortune tellers. I didn't. You need a license to practice fortune telling. Is that how does one go about getting a fortune telling license? Um, Walter believes that these licensing laws are a means of restricting entry into an occupation, perhaps, benefiting only those who are already practicing the trade. Some such laws, he maintains, are truly outrageous. For example, taxi cab licensing requirements in New York City that include an entry fee of $500,000. Ouch. He believes that these regulations result in the exclusion of less skilled, less experienced, and less wealthy persons, many of whom are black. Williams acknowledges the union claim that licensing laws are needed to screen out unscrupulous practitioners, but he argues that in some trades, especially electricians, railroad workers, truckers, and plumbers, the laws have been purposely written to restrict the entry of blacks. Wow. Williams also has concerns about racial profiling charges made against police officers accused of stopping black or Hispanic drivers more often than non-Hispanic whites. Similar accusations have been made against certain taxi drivers, alleging that they refused to provide rides to blacks. Williams cited a 1999 story by James Owens in which mainly black and Hispanic cab drivers in Washington, D.C. voiced support for racial profiling, and Commissioner Sandra Seegers, also black, warned cabbies to stay away from low-income black neighborhoods. Pizza companies that deliver also have been accused of racial profiling for refusing to deliver to certain neighborhoods, often crime-ridden and primarily black ones. Since some of the delivery drivers who refused were themselves black, Williams believes that the accusation is specious. I think that's how you say it. No, sorry, it's specious. And specious means superficially plausible but actually wrong. So in 1991, Jesse Jackson stated that it is criminal that banks systematically discriminate against African Americans and Latinos in making mortgage loans. Walter argues that discrimination was not involved. Okay, he's saying that it's not a discrimination thing when it comes to like banking loans and that sort of a thing. Rather, the huge difference in net worth and credit scores of blacks and whites, even those who have the same monthly income, was to blame. Williams contends that if banks were discriminating against blacks by making their loan approvals more difficult, then black default rates would be lower. And he cites a 1992 Federal Reserve study which found that blacks and whites default rates were roughly equivalent. He also claims that the insistence. So he also claims that the insistence of many in Congress in recent years that home ownership be made more available in the form of subprime loans to low-income people was a primary cause of the collapse of the housing market and the ensuing recession. I agree. I will say I do agree with that. And I think that may have came about during the Clinton administration. Not being shady, just saying. Where it was like, instead of people who, it was like, oh, everyone deserves a house, right? That was sort of like, oh, everyone deserves a house versus everyone who's qualified to own a house deserves a house, right? And I think that ultimately helped lead to the housing market crash and thus the recession. Let's see. Had lending institutions been allowed to set their own requirements, William offends many of our recent economic problems could have been avoided. Yeah. Now they have, standards and policies in place now to kind of help prevent that, right? Now it's a buyer's market, you know. If you can qualify, then you're good. Since a lot of people are like selling, and not there's people buying, but not as many people are buying. Then it's like, Let's see. The thesis of this book is that attempts in the last 50 years to lessen the economic gap between blacks and whites through government interventions have been unsuccessful and may even have worsened the situation. Perhaps. But I do feel like, this. If black people were just left alone and if everything and everybody were just like, whatever, fair is fair, just compete, I think black people would have been better off. But there were so many like barriers in place to, hinder black competition. That's the thing, though, you know. And I think that's what kind of makes black people a little uncomfortable, a little scared, frightened when it comes to, government intervention and economic policies. And I think that's kind of like that plays a big role in like black people supporting the Democratic Party a lot, because the Democratic Party tends to more or less pander to black people in regards to like, oh, these government programs and things like that, you know. they kind of like, quote unquote, speak their language, and it's very much low key psychological, like speak their language and tell them things that they want to hear, right? Versus the things that they kind of need to hear, right? Because you want the vote, you got to get that vote, right? So William argues that free market resources, well, Walter, his last name is Williams. In the article, of course, you tend to refer to the person as their last name when it comes to a person's name, but I switched it around and referred to him as Walter to make it a bit more, intimate, relatable. So Walter argues that free market resource allocation would have been a better solution for both minorities and the public in general. Race and Economics is an easy read, well written and well researched. William provides 24 pages of footnotes to support his arguments. For those readers open to looking at the issue of race and economics from a distinctly conservative point of view, I strongly recommend this book. Ronald Johnson, Office of Prices and Living Conditions, Bureau of Labor Statistics. And I think I may end up maybe perhaps getting this book and reading it at one point or another. And also his autobiography. I'm really interested in his kind of backstory, upbringing, and his journey to him getting to where he is now. But yeah, that's pretty much all I have to say. So what do you have to say? Let me know in the comments section. Until the next video, adios and goodbye for now.